Hello and welcome to APTN National News Weekend. I'm your host, Sav Jonesa. First Nations children living on reserve in Manitoba are now eligible for Children's Disability Services and home care after a 14-year legal battle. Here's more on that story. In 2010, Harriet Sumner Pruden and her son, Dewey, sought to make change through a complaint to the Manitoba Human Rights Commission, or MHRC. Dewey, who was only 8 years old at the time, needed access to provincial disability-related services like home care and physiotherapy. But because he lived on their reserve of Penamutang First Nation, Dewey was often denied or delayed that help by the Manitoba government. In 2014, Harriet said she knew they weren't alone in their struggle with discrimination.
It's still a long battle, but I'm hoping within his lifetime things change.
Now, after 14 years of determination, those eligibility restrictions have finally come to an end thanks to a settlement agreement between the Manitoba government, the MHRC, and Dewey's family. It comes with two main commitments from the province: to expand children's disability services and home care eligibility to First Nations children living on reserve, and to create a working group with federal and First Nations governments to see how those services can be best delivered. Harriet says she feels relieved that what she set out to fix has now been resolved and looks forward to the working group's findings.
I don't have any concerns at all because I know it includes our First Nations and also with both federal and provincial governments. So, we're at a time where the topic of reconciliation is on the table, and I hope, it moves forward in a positive way.
The Manitoba Human Rights Commission's Executive Director, Karen Sharma, says that dialogue is necessary to address the disparity in services First Nations communities face.
And we think that's an important component as well, because of course we want to make sure that First Nations children living in Manitoba have access to the supports that they're entitled to, but we need to go a step further to improve the supports that are out there and also better align those supports with the right to self-determination. There's a commitment for that to be taking place over the coming couple of years, and a requirement that reporting occur to our commission. Will be sort of monitoring that taking place every 6 months, so that we can see that there's been real progress toward that commitment to really ensure that the services and supports that are needed for First Nations children are happening in Manitoba.
Now, little Dewey is an adult, 22 years old, and will no longer directly benefit from the change. Still living in Penamutang, Harriet says her son continues to have difficulties in accessing services near their community, roughly 220 kilometers north of Winnipeg.
They don't have the same resources, as any other, with home care, I'd have to look deeper into that, I guess, because, we do have limited resources in our communities, our First Nation communities.
She says Dewey signing the settlement agreement reminded them of their ancestor, former Penamutang chief Richard Woodhouse, who was a signatory of Treaty 2.
I always hear that echoing in my mind, them speaking to me and saying, be resilient and keep moving forward.
Harriet says she is thankful to the Public Interest Law Centre and MHRC for their continued support all these years. Sav Jonesa, APTN National News, Winnipeg. It's been 13 years since Tanya Nepinaks from the Pine Creek First Nation went missing in Winnipeg. Her family has never stopped fighting for justice. This Thursday, on her birthday, Nepinaks' family and a community of supporters held a walk and feast in Winnipeg to honor her life and demand action for MMIWG 2S+. Reporter Sierra Beddens brings you to the walk.
On what would have been her 45th birthday, dozens gathered to honor Tanya Nepinaks, who went missing 13 years ago in downtown Winnipeg, calls to search for Nepinak are spray painted on sidewalks. Marchers wore red to honor all missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people. Her aunt, Sue Caribou, handed out Justice for Tanya shirts created in her honor.
I have a lot of mixed feelings today. I'm overwhelmed because it's been a long time since we celebrated Tanya's birthday, and today is so emotional for me.
Nepinak was a member of the Pine Creek First Nation in northwestern Manitoba. She was last seen on September 13th, 2011. The then 31-year-old left her home on Sherbrooke Street to walk to a pizza place around the block and was never seen again. In June 2012, Sean Lamb was charged with second-degree murder in connection to Nepinak's disappearance, but those charges were later stayed. At the Thursday walk, Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, Acting Grand Chief Betsy Kennedy, remembered attending the first march held for Nepinak over a decade ago.
And I was with family when they went to the Brady landfill a number of years ago. So that's the reason why I'm here today, is to provide and let the family know that I still think about her all the time.
As the community came together to sing happy birthday and offer medicines to Nepinak's family, her aunt voiced her demands for justice.
Most of our missing and murdered are probably at these landfills, just like the unmarked graves. So I think they should search all the landfills and consider the landfills as a crime scene and stop putting trash on our loved ones. They're not trash.
Sierra Bettens, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
It's an almost forgotten piece of legislation, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, or UNDRIP. Its action plan promised a lot of things, like protecting inherent Indigenous rights, the right to self-determination, and addressing injustices like systemic racism. A Senate committee is currently studying how UNDRIP is being implemented. Former Minister of Justice Jody Wilson-Raybould was the key witness on Tuesday. She called UNDRIP a good start, but said deeper reforms are needed to ensure its success. Wilson-Raybould gave one example.
Establishing new effective and efficient mechanisms for a nation getting their land back or the resolution of disputes outside of the courts, as well as new Indigenous institutions that are independent from the federal government, that importantly support the work of nation and government rebuilding.
And a court hearing in the BC Supreme Court is currently underway that could potentially change the lives of thousands of Indigenous kids that were put into the child welfare system. APTN's Tina House has the story.
A class action lawsuit against Canada and the BC government for the mistreatment of kids in the child welfare system was launched today. Lawyers representing them say many were taken away from their culture, families, and many were abused. It has the potential to impact up to 10,000 plaintiffs, says lawyer Angela Beskflug.
We are here today seeking certification of an action on behalf of survivors of the Millennium Scoop, so off-reserve First Nation, Métis, and Inuit children, youth, and families. And so our position is, as against Canada and as against the province, that the system was flawed, it was broken, it prioritized removal over prevention services. It would have kept children with their families.
Jessie Neal was once one of those kids. She says she grew up in the system and is here to fight for other kids who were also taken away.
It's appalling to see how many young people are still treated inequitable, and how much of the care population we make up, over 60% of kids in care in BC specifically are Indigenous and placed in non-Indigenous homes, and as a result, have big holes in their lives.
Laura Dobson is also another plaintiff. She says for kids in care, the number has surpassed kids that were in residential school, and the conditions are not much different in many cases. She wants to see some major changes for other kids.
More resources, I think, like counseling, bridging the gaps, more supports, reunification. I know a lot of people say that there's lack of Indigenous homes for Indigenous children.
For the next 5 days, Laura and Jesse, along with 2 other plaintiffs and their lawyers, will be presenting their evidence in court.
The defendants have known about this for decades and decades and decades and have failed to remedy the situation. Because of that, our class members, our plaintiffs, have suffered harm. They can't be remedied by any compensation, but our goal is to, A, have the defendants acknowledge the wrongful behavior, B, get compensation for these plaintiffs and other class members, and C, try and get the defendants to change their way.
The decision in this class action lawsuit is expected in the next 3 months. Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
Thanks for that, Tina. This summer saw 2 historic court cases take place in Manitoba. After the break, we hear from the judge who presided over them. Stay tuned. You've probably heard his name in our reporting over the years. Glenn Joyle has been the Chief Justice of Manitoba Court of King's Bench since 2011. This past summer, he presided over 2 court cases APTN followed closely. A trial that found serial killer Jeremy Skibitsky guilty of 4 first-degree murders for Rebecca Comtois, Morgan Harris, Mercedes Myron, and Buffalo Woman. And earlier this month, he acquitted Clarence Woodhouse for wrongful conviction of a murder from the 1970s. He sat down with T.R. Wheatley recently to talk about those recent trials, the calls to justice from MMIW G2S inquiry, judicial reconciliation, and the United Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP.
Skibitsky is such a unique situation in the sense that it really was, for so many people, emblematic of everything that the missing murdered women and girls inquiry was all about. So we really had a responsibility, I think, obviously to ensure that the accused in that case had a fair trial, but we also had a responsibility to ensure that deeply felt trauma by all the victims' families, but also the larger community, was properly addressed in a trial. There was present in the courtroom, certain things that I think were meaningful, not just for what it was representing in terms of the legal issues, but also for our court's efforts at judicial reconciliation.
You mentioned it, the National Inquiry legal document. I want to speak to certain calls to justice and how you're trying to implement those here.
We have to be humble with respect to how much we can do in responding to some of those recommendations. The justice system obviously involves many actors, so we're not involved in the investigative role, we're not involved in the prosecutorial part of things. We simply adjudicate, we judge, we assess, whether it's a judge alone or with a jury. But to the extent that those cases come to us, I think we have a real responsibility to ensure that we handle them as quickly as we can, but also if we're not dealing with them in a way that's sufficiently, I think, sensitive, empathetic, and responsive to what are the unique challenges facing that type of investigation, that type of prosecutions.
The Woodhouse, his conviction, 50 years. Talk about that trial and the injustices.
Well, it's a tragedy. So when it happens because of bad identity, a lack of disclosure, the way the case might have been prosecuted, or the way the case might have been adjudicated and judged, that's not a good thing. When the same case involving, I think, Mr. Woodhouse's brother 2 years ago, those are cases for which the system has a hard time offering an explanation. One of the ways we have to do that is when we see cases that can be identifiably called systemic discrimination, we have to call it out, and we have to address it, and we have to apologize for it.
What are some of the changes you've implemented generally, but also, in relation to Indigenous people?
So in every area where we've tried to make improvements, and they don't just relate to the Indigenous communities, but a lot of them do, we've tried to make things less costly, less complex, and more quick. One is child protection. The Family Division brought in some very important reforms that, in the context of these tragic apprehensions, sped up the process because it was happening for too long. is a situation where these kids who were apprehended were in limbo, sometimes for 24, 36 months. And bad things happen when children are apprehended and they remain in limbo. Phoenix Sinclair is a good example, right? Similarly, in the criminal law, we've tried to do that as well. Because as you know, unfortunately, it's more likely once an Indigenous person is arrested for that person to be denied bail. They don't get out. So the socioeconomic realities make it much more difficult for them to get out on bail pending a trial. 2017, where I struck a committee. It's called the Trust, Reconciliation, and Access to Justice Committee. So it's TRAC in short. This is a committee made up of about 7 or 8 judges and now 5 community members. Some significant participation by Indigenous community members. We're educating ourselves about Indigenous legal traditions, Indigenous legal orders, those things that I think are increasingly part of what it is Indigenous leaders and Indigenous communities want us to understand and in fact incorporate and integrate to the extent we can into our own processes. As well, the education is basically exposing ourselves to individuals who come and teach us and talk to us. Nagan Sinclair, for example, came and did a half morning on UNDRIP. Judges were very interested and very engaged. We're not doing enough sort of in community or on the land training yet, but we're planning that as well. The other 2 pieces are big systemic change and smaller systemic change. A good example of that is what we did 2 or 3 years ago when we brought in the Eagle Feather. A really meaningful, I think, step, but it wasn't done. The bigger systemic change involves ways that we might collaborate with or sometimes get out of the way of initiatives that are being brought by Indigenous communities in respective ways they're assuming now what they believe is their own jurisdiction. And you're going to start seeing more and more of that, I think, in child protection. And you're going to start seeing the development of that as various courts, including the Supreme Court of Canada, address the extent to which Section 35 and the Indigenous right of self-determination plays out and evolves in a fashion that's going to require courts maybe to re-examine how we either work with, collaborate, or coexist with Indigenous justice systems and certainly Indigenous legal traditions.
Let's talk about UNDRIP. Mm-hmm. From your perspective.
Well, UNDRIP is a thing. It's now been adopted in a way in Canada where we as a judiciary have to deal with it and have to understand it and understand that it's going to have implications for how we interpret our own governing law. We're going to be even better placed, I think, able to bring a perspective that will better reflect what it is we have to do when we're dealing with issues that touch Indigenous issues, whether it's a duty to consult case, whether it's a matter in the criminal realm, or whether it's a matter respecting a child welfare issue. All of that is now going to play out in ways that I think are going to be in some way connected to the broad principles and ideals of UNDRIP. So we have to deal with it.
Thanks, TR, for the highlights of that sit-down interview with Chief Justice Joyle. If you want to hear more from their conversation, the full sit-down interview can be found on the APTN News YouTube channel. And we're going to take one last quick break. We'll see you back here in just a few moments. Welcome back. Last weekend marked a significant milestone for First Nations representation in the Canadian Armed Forces. On Saturday, Joyle Peterson, a member of the Fond du Lac First Nation in Saskatchewan, became the first First Nations person to be appointed Brigade Sergeant Major of the 38th Canadian Brigade. Reporter Sierra Beddens brings you to the ceremony and talks with Peterson about his journey.
At a Canadian Forces base in Winnipeg, Chief Warrant Officer Joyle Peterson received some new insignia on his uniform. As a crowd erupted in applause, he became the first First Nation person to hold the role of Brigade Sergeant Major in the Canadian Armed Forces.
Being a First Nations person is really important for me to provide opportunities for men and women who maybe didn't see themselves being able to be in a position like this. It shows that you can.
A member of the Fond du Lac First Nation in Saskatchewan, Peterson grew up in Brandon, Manitoba, and Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. He joined the forces at 17.
My mom actually kind of inspired me to join. She was in the military as a young person, and so was my dad. And she encouraged me to look at joining the Army Reserves, and that's what I did.
In his new role, Peterson will oversee 16 Army Reserve units in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Northwest Ontario.
The position of the brigade sergeant major is I'm the most senior sergeant major within the brigade, and my responsibility really is to all the men and women of the brigade. The brigade is both operationally domestic, fighting fires, floods, but also international operations. So it's a busy brigade.
During the ceremony, Peterson was honored for his role as a mentor in the Bold Eagle program. Since 1989, the 6-week summer program, run by the Canadian Armed Forces, has provided military training to Indigenous youth.
The program in the essence of it was to really build that bridge for younger people. And I think what it's grown into now is a real opportunity for reconciliation for a lot of people. And we see now, after 30 plus years, we see generations of those Bold Eagle graduates.
Dutch Laratte, the second vice chief of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, traveled from Saskatchewan for the ceremony. He described Peterson as a role model to many.
It puts one First Nation from Fond du Lac, northern Saskatchewan, into a position now where he can continue being that role model not only to those at home but those within the Army structure. So it's a very important day, and we're here to celebrate that with him.
From Canada and the U.S. to Norway and Italy, Peterson's military career has taken him around the world. He looks forward to rising to the challenge in his new role.
I've gone a lot of places, and those are all great experiences, but where I'm at now is an opportunity to share with others the importance of what not only being a First Nation person can do, but also to ensure, that the success of the brigade as we move forward into a time where we're going to be more in demand and more operational.
Reflecting on his career, he shares advice for Indigenous youth interested in joining the forces.
For those Indigenous guys and gals that are thinking of joining the military as a career, it's a wonderful career. There's lots of opportunities, and when a door opens, you need to take the opportunity and step through it.
Sierra Bettens, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Well, that's all the time we have for your APTN National News Weekend tonight. Thanks for tuning in during this Thanksgiving weekend. If you're looking for more stories, please visit our website at aptnnews.ca. Coming up in just a few moments is a new episode of APTN Investigates, so make sure to stick around. I'm Sav Jonesa, and from all of us here at APTN, take care of each other and have a great weekend.